The negotiation room aboard the Thessari command vessel Sovereign's Reach has the particular atmosphere of a space where people have been talking in careful, controlled voices for 3 hours without resolving anything substantial. Captain Elias Vance sits at the human delegation side of the conference table with the practiced composure that 8 years of diplomatic negotiation work have built, posture relaxed but attentive, expression neutral but engaged, voice modulated to project calm authority without aggression. He's represented human interests in dozens of alliance negotiations over those 8 years, and he's learned through extensive experience that how you occupy space during difficult conversations matters as much as what you say. Across the table, Commander Thessara leads the Thessari delegation with the controlled intensity of someone who believes she holds the stronger position and intends to leverage that strength into favorable outcomes. She's impressive, tall even by Thessari standards, with elongated ears bearing military insignia that communicate decades of command experience, and skin that shifts through colors with the fluid precision of someone who has mastered the art of communicating exactly what she wants others to perceive. The room is full, approximately 30 people total, 15 on each side, a mix of military advisors, diplomatic staff, technical experts, and senior officials, whose presence communicates that both species consider this negotiation important enough to warrant high-level attention. The stated purpose of the session is resolving disputes about trade routes and territorial boundaries in the Thessara sector. Contested space, where human expansion and Thessari established territory overlap in ways that create friction. Unauthorized patrols, disputed claims about which species has navigation priority in specific corridors, accusations of military presence exceeding what alliance agreements permit, standard alliance friction, the kind that requires negotiation to prevent escalation into something more serious. But the real dynamic in the room, the thing that has been building steadily over 3 hours of careful verbal exchanges, is a test of will. Thessara probing to find where Elias will react emotionally rather than strategically, where the calm diplomatic composure will crack and reveal defensiveness, frustration, or any other emotional response that Thessari negotiators are trained to recognize and exploit. Elias has been aware of this dynamic since approximately 40 minutes into the session, when Thessara's questions shifted from substantive inquiry about territorial claims to something more pointed, more personal, designed not to gather information but to provoke reaction. It's a tactic he's encountered before in Thessari negotiations. Not universal, many Thessari negotiators operate with straightforward professionalism, but common enough, particularly among military-trained Thessari officials who view negotiation as an extension of tactical operations where psychological pressure is a legitimate tool. The tactic works by sustained application. A series of questions, each slightly more pointed than the last, building pressure incrementally until the target eventually responds emotionally. Once that happens, the Thessari negotiator has established dominance, demonstrated that they can control the emotional tenor of the room, forcing their counterpart to react on terms the Thessari negotiator sets. Elias has watched human negotiators fall into this pattern dozens of times, has fallen into it himself during his early career, before he learned to recognize the tactic and develop the specific kind of emotional regulation required to navigate it without taking the bait. The current session has followed the standard progression. Thessara began with substantive questions about human patrol frequency in contested corridors, moved to pointed questions about whether human military presence exceeds treaty obligations, escalated to questions that subtly imply human negotiators aren't being forthcoming about their actual territorial intentions, each question delivered with controlled intensity, each one designed to trigger defensive responses. Elias has navigated them with practiced calm, answering substantively when the questions deserve substantive response, acknowledging valid concerns without conceding invalid accusations, maintaining steady composure throughout. But he can feel the pressure building, can sense Thessara preparing to escalate to whatever question she's been constructing over 3 hours of careful psychological groundwork. The question designed to finally break through his composure and produce the emotional reaction that will shift the room's power dynamic firmly in her favor. Lieutenant Maya Torres, Elias' senior aide, sits to his right with her own carefully maintained neutral expression. But Elias can read the slight tension in her shoulders. She recognizes what's happening too, feels the building pressure, is wondering how he's going to handle whatever Thessara asks next. The rest of the human delegation shows varying degrees of awareness, some clearly uncomfortable with the session's tone, but uncertain how to address it. Others focused on their technical materials, either missing the psychological dynamic or choosing not to engage with it. The Thessari delegation shows unified calm, skin colors carefully managed to project confidence and control. They're following Thessara's lead, supporting the pressure she's building through their collective composed attention. Admiral Kethros sits at the back of the room, technically present as senior Thessari military observer rather than active participant. His role is to monitor the negotiation and provide strategic assessment to Thessari High Command afterward. He's been watching with the focused attention of someone who has conducted hundreds of negotiations himself and can read the tactical patterns as fluently as written text. Elias catches Kethros's eye briefly during a pause in the discussion. The Admiral's expression is difficult to read, but his skin shows contemplative blue, the color that indicates analytical processing rather than emotional reaction. He's evaluating something, possibly evaluating how Elias is handling Thessara's sustained pressure. The session continues. Technical discussions about patrol schedules, detailed examination of treaty language regarding territorial sovereignty, the substantive work that negotiations require happening in parallel with the psychological contest underneath it. And then, approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes into the session, Thessara shifts her posture slightly, a small physical change that Elias recognizes immediately as the signal that she's transitioning to whatever she's been building toward. The room feels it too, a subtle change in atmosphere as the Thessari delegation becomes slightly more attentive, the human delegation slightly more tense. Everyone present understanding that something significant is about to happen even if they can't articulate exactly what or why. Thessara looks directly at Elias with an expression of controlled intensity. Her skin settles into the deep, focused gold that Thessari use when they're about to deliver something important and want everyone paying attention. "Captain Vance," she says, and her voice carries the precise, measured authority of someone who has practiced this moment carefully. "I've been conducting alliance negotiations for 15 years. I've negotiated with 7 different human representatives during that time, and I've observed a consistent pattern." She pauses deliberately. The room is completely silent. "Every human negotiator I've worked with eventually reaches a point where their diplomatic composure breaks," Thessara continues, "where the pressure of maintaining careful responses becomes too much and genuine emotion emerges, usually defensiveness, sometimes frustration, occasionally anger. It's a human limitation that I've learned to recognize and navigate." Another pause. Her gaze remains locked on Elias. "You've maintained exceptional composure throughout this session," Thessara says, "better than most. But I find myself wondering, is the composure genuine, or is it simply that you haven't yet been pushed to the point where it breaks?" The question lands in the silent room, with the weight of something carefully aimed. It's not a question about territory or patrols or treaty obligations. It's a direct, personal challenge, an accusation disguised as inquiry, designed to force Elias into either defending his emotional control, which would be defensive, and therefore exactly the break in composure Thessara is probing for, or acknowledging limitation, which would concede the psychological contest she's been conducting. Every person in the room is watching, waiting to see how the human negotiator responds to a question specifically designed to be impossible to answer without consequence. Elias takes a breath. Not a sharp intake of air that would signal offense or surprise. Not a deliberate, visible pause designed to create dramatic tension. Just a normal, unhurried breath. The kind that happens naturally when someone is processing a question they've been asked and wants to answer it thoughtfully. The room remains silent, waiting. Skin colors throughout the Thessari delegation showing anticipation mixed with confidence that Thessara's pointed question has finally created the break in composure they've been working toward. Lieutenant Torres has gone very still beside Elias. Her expression is carefully neutral, but he can sense her tension. She's bracing for how he's going to handle this, uncertain whether he'll take the bait or find a way to navigate it without giving Thessara the reaction she's clearly seeking. Elias looks at Thessara with the same calm, attentive expression he's maintained throughout the 3-hour session. His posture doesn't change. His voice, when he speaks, carries the same measured, unhurried quality it's carried throughout. "That's a fair question," he says. The words are simple, direct, delivered without any of the defensive edge that Thessara's question was designed to provoke. Not dismissive, acknowledging that the question is legitimate rather than deflecting it as inappropriate or offensive. Elias continues, his voice maintaining the same calm steadiness. "You're right that composure under pressure eventually breaks for most people. That's true across species. Maintaining careful emotional regulation during sustained, difficult conversations requires effort, and eventually that effort exceeds what most people can sustain indefinitely." He pauses not for dramatic effect, but because he's organizing his thoughts, choosing his words with care. "But I think the question you're really asking is whether my composure is strategic performance or genuine state," Elias says. "Whether I'm working hard to maintain diplomatic calm that might break under sufficient pressure, or whether I'm actually calm in a way that doesn't require active maintenance." Thessara's skin flickers slightly, a brief shift in color that suggests Elias' response isn't following the pattern she anticipated. She doesn't interrupt, waiting to see where he's going. "The honest answer is both," Elias continues. "Some of my composure is deliberate. I'm choosing to respond calmly to questions that are designed to provoke defensiveness. That's conscious effort, but the foundation underneath that effort is genuine. I'm not particularly bothered by pointed questions. I don't feel defensive about human territorial intentions or our negotiating approach. I'm genuinely interested in resolving the substantive issues that brought us to this table." He looks at Thessara directly, his expression open and unhurried. "So if your question is, will sustained pressure eventually make me lose composure and respond emotionally? Probably, if the session lasted long enough. Everyone has limits. But if your question is, am I currently working hard to suppress defensive reactions? No, I'm not. I'm just responding to your questions as directly as I can while trying to keep the conversation focused on the actual problems we're here to solve." The room has changed, subtly but unmistakably. Skin colors throughout the Thessari delegation are shifting, the confident gold fading into more contemplative blues and analytical purples. Several advisors are exchanging glances, nonverbal communication passing between them that suggests Elias' response has created something unexpected, because he hasn't done what Thessara's question was designed to make him do. Hasn't become defensive about his composure. Hasn't tried to prove his emotional control through assertion or counter-challenge. Hasn't taken the bait in any of the ways that would have confirmed the pattern Thessara described. Instead, he's answered honestly and calmly, acknowledging both the effort and the genuineness, treating Thessara's pointed personal question as though it were a legitimate inquiry rather than a psychological tactic, and doing so without making his response confrontational or challenging. And in that calm, direct response, he's quietly dismantled the entire framework Thessara was trying to establish. Because you can't fight against genuine calm the way you can fight against defensive composure. Defensiveness has edges you can push against. Genuine calm has nothing to grip. It simply exists, and forcing confrontation against it makes the person forcing the confrontation look like they're the one being unreasonable. Elias continues, his voice carrying the same unhurried quality. If the goal of your question was to test whether I can be provoked into defensive reactions, you've confirmed that I can recognize when I'm being tested and respond to it directly rather than taking the bait. If the goal was genuine curiosity about whether my composure is sustainable, I've given you an honest answer about both the effort and the foundation. He pauses and then adds, but I'd like to suggest that we might make more progress on the actual territorial disputes if we focus our energy on the substantive issues rather than on testing each other's psychological limits. We've spent 3 hours on valuable but difficult conversation. I'd rather use our remaining time to actually resolve something rather than to continue probing whether either delegation can be provoked into emotional responses. The suggestion is delivered without accusation, without criticism, simply as a practical observation about how the session's time might be most productively used. Thessara is silent for a long moment. Her skin cycles through colors that Elias has learned to read as active processing, someone reassessing their approach in real time, because the tactic they were employing isn't producing the expected results. Then something shifts in her expression. Not surrender, not concession. Something more like recognition, the look of someone who has just encountered a negotiating approach they haven't seen before and is genuinely uncertain how to respond to it. You're right, Thessara says, and there's something in her voice that sounds different from the controlled intensity she's maintained throughout the session. Something more genuine, less tactical. I have been testing your composure. It's standard practice in Thessari military negotiation. Establish psychological dominance early in the session, and subsequent substantive disagreements become easier to resolve in your favor. She pauses, her skin settling into contemplative blue. But you've just demonstrated that the tactic doesn't work when the target recognizes it, acknowledges it directly, and refuses to engage with it emotionally while still responding to it honestly. That's not a pattern I've encountered before. Elias nods. I'm familiar with the tactic. I've seen it used effectively in other negotiations. It works particularly well against negotiators who take pointed questions personally and feel compelled to defend themselves emotionally rather than responding substantively. He pauses. But I don't take the questions personally. You're employing a legitimate negotiation strategy. I can acknowledge that and respond to it directly without needing to be defensive about it. And now that we've both acknowledged what's been happening, maybe we can move past it and focus on the actual problems. The room's atmosphere has fundamentally changed. The charged tension that has been building for 3 hours hasn't disappeared. The substantive disagreements about territory and patrols still exist, but the quality of the tension has shifted. It's no longer a psychological contest about who can dominate the emotional dynamic. It's become something more straightforward, a difficult conversation between parties with genuine disagreements who are approaching those disagreements without the overlay of tactical psychological pressure. Postures throughout both delegations have relaxed incrementally. Not dramatically, everyone is still engaged, still attentive, but the rigidity has eased. The sense of bracing for confrontation has given way to something more productive. Admiral Kethros, observing from the back of the room, shows colors that Elias can't fully interpret, but that look like a combination of analytical interest and something that might be approval. The negotiation continues for another 90 minutes after Thessara's pointed question and Elias' calm response. But the character of the session has fundamentally changed in ways that everyone present can feel, even if they can't all articulate exactly what shifted or why. Thessara's questions become substantive rather than probing. Her energy goes into actually understanding human positions on territorial disputes rather than into testing psychological boundaries. The exchanges become more direct, more focused on the actual problems rather than on the tactical contest underneath them. Elias maintains the same steady composure he's shown throughout, but now it's matched by similar steadiness from the Thessari delegation rather than being pushed against by sustained pressure. The conversation becomes genuinely productive in ways that the first 3 hours weren't. Both sides identifying areas of actual agreement that had been obscured by the psychological dynamics, finding compromise positions on issues that had seemed intractable when approached through tactical maneuvering. By the time the session concludes, both delegations have reached preliminary agreements on patrol scheduling, territorial boundary clarifications, and communication protocols that will prevent future incidents from escalating. The agreements will require formal documentation and approval from both species governments, but the substantive work of finding mutually acceptable terms has been accomplished. Not everything is resolved. Several issues remain genuinely contentious and will require additional negotiation sessions to address. But progress has been made, real progress, built on actual understanding rather than on one side establishing dominance over the other. As the delegations begin gathering materials and preparing to depart, Admiral Kethros approaches Elias with the deliberate pace of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to initiate a private conversation. "Captain Vance," Kethros says, his voice carrying the measured authority of senior military rank. "I observed something during this session that I'd like to discuss with you briefly, if you have a moment." "Of course, Admiral," Elias replies, noting that Lieutenant Torres and the rest of the human delegation are already moving toward the exit, giving him space for whatever private conversation Kethros is initiating. The Thessari delegation is likewise dispersing, though Commander Thessara remains near the conference table, engaged in conversation with her senior advisors. She glances toward Elias and Kethros but doesn't approach, respecting the space for private exchange while clearly aware it's happening. Kethros leads Elias to a quieter corner of the room, positioned where their conversation won't be overheard but where they're still visible to anyone observing. In Thessari military culture, Elias has learned, truly private conversations happen in private spaces. Conversations that occur in public view, but at conversational distance, are understood to be personal but not secret. "I've been conducting and observing alliance negotiations for 23 years, Kethros begins without preamble. "I've seen hundreds of sessions between human and Thessari delegations. And I've observed the tactic that Commander Thessara employed today, sustained psychological pressure, designed to establish dominance, succeed far more often than it fails." He pauses, his skin showing contemplative blue. "What you did when she asked her pointed question about your composure was the most effective counter to that tactic I've seen any human negotiator employ." "I just answered honestly," Elias says, acknowledged both the effort and the genuineness without being defensive about either. "Exactly," Kethros confirms. "You refused to engage with the framework she was trying to establish, the contest over who controls the emotional dynamic. But you did so without making that refusal confrontational. You simply answered her question directly and suggested moving to substantive issues. That's extraordinarily difficult to fight against." He looks at Elias with an expression of genuine interest. "In Thessari military culture, we have a concept called Thessara, roughly translated as the redirection through stillness. It refers to the ability to change power dynamics not through force or assertion, but through refusing to engage with confrontation while remaining present and engaged. It's considered one of the most sophisticated tactical approaches precisely because it's so difficult to counter. I'm familiar with the concept, Elias says, though I wasn't consciously applying it. I was just trying to keep the conversation focused on what actually mattered rather than on the psychological contest. That's what makes it effective, Kethros observes. When Thessara is performed deliberately as a tactic, experienced negotiators can recognize it and counter it. But when it emerges naturally from genuine calm rather than strategic calculation, when someone simply isn't bothered by pressure designed to provoke defensive reactions, it becomes almost impossible to work against. Because there's nothing tactical to counter, the person is just genuinely calm. He pauses, considering how to articulate something complex. Commander Thessara is an excellent negotiator. She employs psychological pressure effectively in most contexts because most negotiators feel compelled to defend themselves when challenged personally. But genuine calm can't be defended against. It simply exists. And forcing confrontation against it makes the person forcing the confrontation look unreasonable. So her question about whether my composure would eventually break was already acknowledging that the tactic wasn't working, Elias observes. Precisely, Kethros confirms. She was trying one final, direct challenge to see if she could provoke the defensive reaction she'd been working toward. And your response, acknowledging the effort, the genuineness, and the test itself without being defensive about any of it, demonstrated that she couldn't. At that point, continuing the psychological pressure would have made her look like she was the one being unreasonable, so she pivoted to substantive engagement instead, which produced better negotiation outcomes for both sides, Elias points out. Much better, Kethros agrees. The preliminary agreements you reached in the last 90 minutes are more comprehensive and more genuinely collaborative than anything that would have emerged if she'd succeeded in establishing psychological dominance. When one side feels they've won the tactical contest, they push for favorable terms rather than seeking genuine compromise. But when the tactical contest is set aside, both sides can focus on finding solutions that actually work. He looks at Elias with an expression that carries genuine respect. I wanted to tell you that what you did today will be studied. I'm writing a strategic assessment of this session for Thessari High Command, and I will be highlighting your response to Commander Thessara's challenge as an example of effective Thessara. Redirection through genuine calm rather than through defensive assertion or counter-challenge. I appreciate that, Admiral, Elias says. Though I should clarify that I wasn't trying to employ Thessari tactical concepts. I was just trying to keep my own emotional regulation intact while staying focused on solving actual problems. That's what genuine Thessara is, Kethros replies. Not a tactic you employ strategically, but a state you maintain naturally when you're genuinely centered rather than performing centeredness. The fact that you weren't consciously applying the concept makes your demonstration of it more valuable, not less. He pauses, then adds, Commander Thessara will learn from this session. She's an excellent officer, and excellent officers adapt when they encounter approaches that counter their standard tactics. Future negotiations with her will likely proceed differently, more substantively engaged from the beginning, less focused on establishing psychological dominance. I look forward to that, Elias says sincerely. She's clearly skilled. I'd rather work with her on solving problems than spend energy navigating tactical pressure. Kethros nods once, the deliberate gesture that communicates acknowledgement and respect in Thessari military culture. The alliance benefits when both species learn to work together more effectively. Today's session moved us forward in that direction. Thank you for your contribution to that progress, Captain Vance. 2 weeks after the negotiation session, the preliminary agreements reached aboard Sovereign's Reach have been formalized through proper governmental channels and are being implemented across the Thessara sector. Patrol schedules revised, territorial boundaries clarified, Communication protocols established that will prevent future incidents from escalating. The practical outcomes are significant enough to be noted in formal alliance documentation as successful conflict resolution. But among the diplomatic and military professionals who work alliance negotiations regularly, the session is remembered for something else. The moment when Commander Thessara asked a pointed personal question designed to break Captain Vance's composure, and his calm, direct response shifted the entire room's dynamic without ever becoming confrontational. Lieutenant Torres mentions it to Elias during a quiet moment in the human embassy on the Thessari homeworld, where they're preparing materials for an upcoming session about trade regulations. People are talking about what happened during the Thessara negotiations, she says, specifically about how you handled Thessara's challenge. I've had 3 different Thessari diplomatic contacts mention it in the past week, all of them describing it as masterful Thessara, whatever that means. Redirection through stillness, Elias explains. Changing power dynamics through genuine calm rather than through force or assertion. Admiral Kethros explained the concept to me after the session. Is that what you were doing? Torres asks, deliberately applying a Thessari tactical concept. No, Elias says. I was just trying to stay calm and focused on substance rather than getting pulled into the psychological contest Thessara was conducting. The fact that it aligned with a Thessari concept was coincidental. Torres considers this. But it worked. The session became productive after that moment. Thessara stopped trying to establish dominance and started engaging substantively. The room relaxed. We actually got things accomplished. Because genuine calm is harder to fight against than defensive composure, Elias observes. When someone is defensive, you can push against their defensiveness and use their emotional reactions to establish dominance. But when someone is genuinely calm, not performing calm but actually centered, there's nothing to push against. Forcing confrontation against genuine calm just makes you look like you're the one being unreasonable. He pauses, organizing his thoughts. I think that's what happened in that room. Thessara had been building pressure for 3 hours, expecting that eventually I'd become defensive or frustrated or show some emotional reaction she could leverage. When I didn't, when I just acknowledged what she was doing and suggested focusing on substance, she was left with the choice of either continuing to push against someone who clearly wasn't bothered by the pressure, which would have made her look unnecessarily aggressive, or pivoting to substantive engagement. And she chose substantive engagement, Torres observes. Because she's a good negotiator, Elias says. Good negotiators adapt when their tactics aren't producing desired results. She recognized that psychological pressure wasn't working and that continuing it would be counterproductive, so she shifted to a different approach. That's not weakness. That's strategic flexibility. Torres nods slowly. I've been thinking about that moment a lot since the session, about what you did and how you did it, because I've watched other human negotiators handle similar pressure from Thessari counterparts, and I've never seen anyone navigate it the way you did. What do other negotiators do? Elias asks. Usually one of 2 things, Torres replies. Either they become defensive, which is what the pressure is designed to provoke, or they try to counter-challenge, matching the Thessari negotiators' intensity with their own. Both responses feed into the contest over who controls the emotional dynamic. But you didn't do either. You just stayed calm, answered honestly, suggested moving to substance, and somehow that shifted everything. Because it removed the contest, Elias says. When both sides are trying to establish dominance, you get escalation, more pressure, more counterpressure until someone breaks or the session deadlocks. But when one side refuses to engage with the contest while still remaining engaged with the substance, there's nothing to escalate against. The only productive option is to move to substantive discussion. He pauses. I'm not claiming I'm uniquely good at this. I've just had enough experience with Thessari negotiation tactics to recognize them when they're being employed, And I've learned that the most effective response isn't to fight against them, but to acknowledge them directly and suggest focusing on what we're actually there to accomplish. Torres is quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, Admiral Kethros told you that what you did would be studied. Do you think it will actually change how Thessari negotiators approach sessions with humans? Probably not universally, Elias admits. Psychological pressure is a legitimate tactic that works effectively in many contexts, but I think some Thessari negotiators will recognize that it's less effective against humans who can maintain genuine calm rather than defensive composure. And maybe that recognition will lead to more sessions that focus on substance from the beginning, rather than starting with tactical positioning. That would be good for the alliance, Torres observes. It would, Elias agrees, because the alliance needs both species learning to work together more effectively. And that happens more readily when negotiations focus on solving shared problems, rather than on establishing which side can dominate the other psychologically. Months later, when Elias is preparing training materials for new human diplomatic personnel being assigned to alliance work, he includes a section on emotional regulation during difficult negotiations. The core guidance is simple. Genuine calm is more effective than defensive composure. Recognize when you're being tested psychologically. Acknowledge it directly rather than pretending it's not happening. And keep redirecting towards substance rather than engaging with tactical pressure. It's not a guarantee of successful negotiation. Power dynamics, substantive disagreements, and genuine conflicts of interest still require navigation. But it removes one layer of complexity, the contest over who controls the emotional dynamic, and allows negotiators to focus their energy on the actual problems they're supposed to be solving. The alien woman asked a direct question. The human's calm reply shifted the room, not through force, not through assertion, not through defensive reaction or counter-challenge, through genuine steadiness that refused to engage with confrontation while remaining fully engaged with substance. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Postures relaxed. The charged atmosphere rebalanced around a new tone, centered, measured, focused on what actually mattered. And from that shift came progress that the previous 3 hours of tactical maneuvering hadn't produced. Because sometimes the most disruptive response to pressure isn't confrontation. It's calm, real calm, genuine centeredness. The kind that doesn't need to be defended because it isn't performance, it simply is. The alien woman asked her pointed question, designed to unsettle and provoke. The human answered with measured honesty that reframed everything. And the room shifted, not because power was asserted, but because steadiness offered an alternative to the contest everyone thought they were engaged in. That's influence. That's how emotional regulation redirects power dynamics. That's the quiet, profound disruption of genuine calm in spaces charged with expectation of confrontation. The alien woman asked. The human answered calmly. The room shifted, and everything that followed became possible because one person refused to fight while remaining fully present. Thessara, redirection through stillness, not a tactic to employ, a state to maintain. The power of genuine calm to change what everyone thought was inevitable.